Just go start with like, hi, Adaam.
Well, don't you want to start with welcome to uncertain things?
Oh, you want me to do that? Okay.
I don't know.
I mean, I still think we should start with you and I saying hello. So,
Okay.
Hey, Adaam.
Hey, Vanessa.
So this week we have someone near and dear to your heart and mind, Mr. Tom Holland.
Yes, Tom Holland, the historian, not Spider-Man. Tom is one of those few historians who is really well known. Now, primarily, he's known as the guy who started my infatuation with Roman history. Secondly, he's known for Rubicon, which is his book about the Roman Republic. It's award-winning, best-selling, reads like a freaking thriller, which isn't surprising considering that Tom started his career writing penny dreadfuls.
There was like an alternate history of Lord Byron as a vampire or something in one of his early novels. And, you know, I wish we could have brought it up.
Right. And you do mention it in passing. But here's the twist. Aside from being a great writer, he's also an extremely rigorous historian. In his work, Tom takes a deep look into how the stories that a society tells itself end up shaping its destiny. And he's done it with the Romans, with the Persian Empire, with the Muslim empires. And now, in his latest book, Dominion, he's doing it with the Christian West. In a way, this is the last chapter of a conversation that we started with Tomer Persico on our first episode.
If you have all the time in the world, which, you know, who doesn't, go ahead and listen to that first. And that should give you the, you know, all the pretext that you need for this conversation.
But if you're lazy, the argument is basically that every intellectual compass that we use today to measure ourselves or to judge what is good and what is bad has its bearings set according to Christian sentiment. Christianity is the North. And this is a wonderfully provocative argument, which can be very unsettling to people who are, say, not Christian, like myself.
That said, I think he does make some compelling arguments. This idea of, for example, human rights. Like there is no, you know, universal truth that every human has a right to X, Y, Z. And he kind of makes this parallel that, you know, that is that sense of belief that we all have human rights. That's actually a descendant of a Christian way of thinking. So that's that kind of stuff that he's talking about here. It's how the very framework of our mind, even if we don't espouse Christian beliefs anymore, those Christian values have snuck in a bit.
Right. And Tom also has this incredible talent to zip across time as if he were Doctor Who, jumping from the Roman Republic to the Black Lives Matter and Me Too movements, all within the span of a single sentence. So we're just going to let him show you the magic.
For your listening pleasure, our conversation with Tom Holland.
So Tom, thank you for joining us and in our attempt to bring some joy to the people.
Well, I'm I'm very honoured to be asked, and I will do my best to bring some joy. But I may not.
No easy task.
So the first time I came across your writing was in my first summer vacation as an undergraduate in the Hebrew University in Jerusalem studying history. And I remember at that time, I was really into history. It's just that I defined history as starting around the 1500s. So I had very little interest in antiquity. But then I read your book, and for the first time, it was like I was seeing those characters that you think you know, like Caesar, Cicero, that you've seen adapted in many novels and plays. But suddenly for your book, it was like, for the first time, I was actually seeing the world through their eyes, on their terms, seeing how different and foreign it is.
This is actually new news to me, Tom, and I know Adaam very well. But I didn't realize that it began with Rubicon, because as far as I've known Adaam, he's been an antiquities nut, as far as I knew. So this is really great to hear.
in that case, I'm thrilled that it had that effect and set you on the course of fascination with antiquity, which I've had since I was about 7. I'll be honest. I've always had it, but I'm always thrilled to spread the news.
How did it start with you?
Well, I was one of those kind of little boys who was obsessed by dinosaurs, and when I look back at it, I realized that what fascinated me about dinosaurs was basically that they were incredibly exotic and thrilling and fierce and frightening and glamorous, and they'd actually existed. So I was much more interested in them than dragons or monsters like that hadn't existed. And basically, my interest in Rome in particular was a kind of seamless evolution, because Rome is really the kind of the tyrannosaur of antiquity. It's the apex predator. And again, like dinosaurs, it's kind of glamorous, fierce, and extinct. It's no longer around. And I think it's that kind of the incredible immediacy. We have so many sources for it. There are so many physical remains. To that extent, we know so much about it, and yet we're separated from such a chasm of time. It's completely gone. And actually, the fascination is that even as you feel you know it, you know that you don't know it. And really, that's been the kind of the balance that I've been aware of throughout my whole life. And it's the kind of fascination that evolves with you as you move through time. And I think also, you mentioned Rubicon. So I began that in around the year 2000, so around the time of the millennium, and there was plenty about it that I thought, because you can tell from my accent, I'm English. The Romans invaded Britain. Julius Caesar invaded Britain. They were active in Gaul, to put it mildly. So I knew that there was a kind of hook there. But what I was more worried about was, would people be interested in the engagement of the Roman Republic, this great imperial republic, in the affairs of the Middle East? And I thought, I don't know, will people be interested in that? And then as I was writing it, 9/11 happened and the build-up to the Second Iraq War. And suddenly everyone was saying, wow, the parallels are amazing. So Rubicon came out just as the sense that Bush's America was a new Rome became part of the kind of the public dialogue. And what that really brought home to me was that the temptation to find parallels with ancient Rome is absolutely irresistible. And I think it's irresistible for everybody in what we might call the West, so in Europe as well as in America. But I think it's particularly irresistible for Americans because the American Republic was very self-consciously founded on the model of ancient Rome. And so although the differences are enormous, there are those kind of parallels that are implicit in the fact that in America you have a Senate, you have a Capitol, you have buildings with loads of columns. And so whenever...
you have a Cincinnati.
Yes, exactly. So whenever some dramatic event happens in American history, and they seem to be happening all the time, the temptation is to say, well, what's the parallel with ancient Rome? So, I would say, the number of times that people say, well, what Roman emperor should we compare Trump to? I'd be an incredibly rich man if I had $1 for every time that happened. It's just irresistible. So I think that Rome, in particular, of all the ancient civilizations, has that kind of weird science fiction quality that it seems very familiar and very strange. And the more familiar it is, and the more strange it becomes, and vice versa. And I think that that's part of the appeal.
It's funny that you say that, because I marked to myself a line from your intro to Rubicon that I always very much loved. And I think that's part of what set me on the new mindset of being able to appreciate antiquity a little bit. And pardon me for quoting you to you, but here goes. If there is much about Rome we can never know, then still there is much that can be brought back to life. Its citizens half emerging from antique marble, their faces illuminated by a background of gold and fire, the glare of an alien yet sometimes eerily familiar world. There's such an insight in this about not just Rome, but history in general. That balance, that it's tempting to see them as reflections of ourselves, and it's valuable to see them as such, but also they're not. They don't understand the world the way we do.
Yeah, and it's interesting you pick on that, because there are two things about that. The first is that when I wrote that, I was thinking about a Mantegna painting that's in the National Gallery here in London. I don't know if you know it, and it shows the coming of Cybele to Rome. And Mantegna, I think in the 15th century, is painting it as a frieze. So it's a painting, but it looks like a frieze, and he's clearly modeled it on Roman friezes that he's studied. So I realize now that even when I was writing that sense, it was kind of mediated through the Renaissance. So that's kind of part of the problem, is that so many people before you have written about Rome that it's very difficult actually to kind of completely have clear eyes yourself. You're always aware of other people's interpretations before you. But the other thing is that over the course of the almost 2 decades now since I wrote Rubicon, my sense of just how different the Romans are, and perforce other ancient civilizations perhaps even more so, has just grown and grown and grown. And as I was writing Rubicon, as I've gone on to write other books, the realization that there are all kinds of words that we use in English that are just so freighted with assumptions that would have meant nothing to the Romans. So words like religion, homosexuality, secular, that English itself, in a way, is a kind of smokescreen that prevents you from seeing or writing about the Romans clearly. And increasingly, I've come to the conclusion that the problem, in terms of getting back to seeing the world in the classical world, is that the Western world has been so affected by one thing in particular, which is the emergence of Christianity and the evolution of Christianity over the course of 2,000 years, that even if you're not a believing Christian, even if you are from another faith tradition, if you use a Western language like English, the risk is that you are so saturated in Christian assumptions that you don't even realize it. So my most recent book, Dominion, that's been the theme of that, is a kind of exploration of what it is about Christianity that makes it so difficult to get back to an understanding of what the pre-Christian world was.
Before we dive into Dominion, which we're definitely going to do, I want to just linger one more second about what you said about English being a smokescreen. And I think it's interesting, not only with words that would not have made any sense to the Romans, like you said, homosexuality and religion, but words that we share, like liberty, which would have meant completely different ideas back then.
Yeah, and I mean, the same goes for Greek. So I'm thinking of democracy. I think there's a kind of temptation to think of democracy in terms of the systems of government that we live under, to think that Athenian democracy has value because it's a precursor for our models of democracy, rather than trying to think of it in its own terms. Because the effort of trying to think yourself into the mindset of an Athenian is so difficult. And I think a crucial part of it is that, in a way, the very standards of investigation that are required by a historian today, at least by today's understanding of what a historian should be doing, in a way are antithetical to getting into the mindset, say, of an ancient Athenian, because we don't believe in the Athenian gods. And we find it almost impossible to imagine that to an Athenian, Athena, the inheritance of the ancient past as the Athenians understood it, is an absolutely necessary precondition for understanding what it was that the Athenians thought their system of government was. Whereas we kind of abstract it. We think of democracy as something that is an abstraction. But that wasn't what it was at all to the Athenians. For the Athenians, it was completely rooted in mythological frameworks, understandings of the way that the universe functioned and the role that humans had within that we find impossible to engage with at all. Because, and in a sense, the difficulty is that the very effort of trying to think yourself into the mindset of an Athenian requires you to let slip the approach to history that is kind of required of someone today in the 21st century in the West writing about history. And this is something I've been really grappling with at the moment, because my current project is a children's history of ancient Greece. And in a way, it's the exciting thing for me in writing it is that because it's for children, I can treat what would seem fantastical to an adult completely literally. So I can write about the gods as though they exist. I can write about Athena as though she really is a present, active participant, as though the explanations that the Greeks give for things, the kind of the bloodlines that they trace back to, the various rapes of Zeus or whatever. And you can imagine it's quite difficult putting that into words that are acceptable for a children's book. But it kind of it gives to history a kind of thrilling quality of fantasy. And yet I think that quality of fantasy, in a way, is truer to the lived experience of people in the 5th century, perhaps, than a kind of cool, objective, analytical study of Greek democracy of the kind that you would get in an academic work, if that makes sense.
I should say to people who haven't read your books yet and are considering buying them, A, that you absolutely should, and B, that this is your, I'd say, method in I think all of your writing, just telling the story through the perspective of those characters to some extent, almost trying to take for granted their assumptions about the world, about nature, about the gods.
And I was also struck too, as I was researching into your background a bit, Tom, about the fact that you actually started off writing novels, which I think speaks very strongly to this kind of approach to writing history, which is about getting into the mindset of how people felt and experienced their world, and as a kind of prerequisite for explaining the history and the context.
Well, my academic background is in literature rather than in history, which some might consider a drawback, but I don't, because the periods that I write about and the things that interest me, I think that the literary quality of the source material is absolutely crucial. So if you look at Antiquity in particular, what we call the primary sources are not what today we'd call a primary source. So Herodotus or Tacitus, say, are highly literary projects. They've already shaped our understanding of it. And so you have this kind of tension in when you look at Herodotus, the first great historian. How do you handle this? Is this a work of literature to be subjected to literary criticism, or is it a kind of great quarry full of facts that have to be carefully sifted and evaluated before you can use it to write history? But I think that ultimately the ambition has to be to try and to acknowledge both. That in a sense there is no prospect of making sense of the ancient past unless you acknowledge the inherently literary and by extension fantastical quality of the source material. And absolutely, if you can in some way embed a perspective that enables the reader to share in your protagonist's understanding, say, of the gods or the miraculous or whatever, then I think that is a justifiable approach. So that's pretty much why I try and write history, I guess, that is literature as much as it is history. And I think that history is the only academic discipline that is also a branch of literature. And I think that there's so much scope for kind of exploration there. And I guess that's also why I've become increasingly interested in the way that what we call religion, although we may come on to why I think that's a very problematic word, but the way that the stories that structure the way that Jews or Christians or Muslims understand the world are fundamental to the way that Jewish or Christian or Muslim history has rolled out, because those stories are, in a sense, absolutely preconditions for for how they see the world. So looking at the moment at Black Lives Matter movement, what is it that underpins that? Because actually it's quite odd, the idea that the oppressed, those who historically have been trampled down, who have not been the leaders in a society, should in a sense not just have the right to improve their lot, but that they should be able to call upon their oppressors to understand what the problem is. So, you look at the Black Lives Matter protests, loads and loads of protesters are white. So what is it that explains that? It doesn't seem self-evident at all. And I think that when you look at the historical roots of Black Lives Matter, it lies in the civil rights movement. And a crucial framework for the civil rights movement, the impact that it had, was that Martin Luther King, the Reverend Martin Luther King, was able to draw analogies between his campaign and Exodus, the idea that God's chosen people were slaves and that God achieved miraculous things and set those slaves free and brought them into a promised land. And that, of course, is a narrative that has a particular resonance for Black Americans because they are themselves the descendants of slaves. But it also has a resonance for white Christians in America, because they too are heirs to those stories. And the idea of an exodus, leaving behind Egypt and going to a promised land, in a way is kind of the foundational myth for white America as well. And so that story, the Exodus story, is, it's not just kind of a background. It's something that has shaped the way that Americans understand their history and therefore has shaped that history itself. And I think that that's completely fascinating because it demonstrates that stories in the Bible, stories that Muslims say tell about the life of Muhammad, that these are not just background. These are things that actively influence the course of events. They are capable of shaking society, reforming society, recalibrating society. And I think that although the Black Lives Matter protests are not overtly Christian, indeed often are quite antithetical to the churches, nevertheless, it's pretty clear where these narratives ultimately are deriving their power from. Because, as I say, the reason that we in the West have an identification with slaves rather than with masters ultimately goes back to Exodus, goes back to a story.
I wonder, Adaam, if we should take a step back and maybe context set a little bit for someone who may have not read the book yet and may not yet understand how clearly there is a connection between this kind of slave-master relationship and how that theme has infiltrated almost every element of our society. And I wonder if we should if you wouldn't mind unpacking that.
Well, as I said, I became interested in first of all how Islam. I wrote a book about the coming of Islam in the eastern half of the Mediterranean, and tried to write about it as the collapse of the Roman Empire in the East. And that was at a time when the Arab Spring was happening and the emergence of ISIS, and it was evident that stories that Muslims told about the origins of their faith were massively seismic in their implications. And again, that this wasn't just kind of background. But also, writing about the Romans, writing about the Greeks, it became very clear to me that these were, in a way, very alien and frightening people. And I compared the Romans to a tyrannosaur. Tyrannosaurs are fascinating, but you wouldn't want one as a pet. And again, when I was writing about the Romans, I would think, well, what is it that has changed? And talked about how the Romans seem familiar to us. They have heated swimming pools and they have property contracts, and Cicero worries about cracks in the walls of his second home and things like this. And it seems so familiar, in a way much more familiar than say the European Middle Ages. But again and again, you're brought up short against aspects of Roman society that just seem incredibly brutal. And I suppose one of those aspects is something that people might be tempted to think is kind of constant and universal, which is attitudes to sex. You might think that sexual feelings have been so constant, it's something every human being feels, that they must be kind of a constant throughout. So people talk about, homosexuality as something, a concept that has existed forever. It's just kind of there. But there is no presence of a concept called homosexuality in Rome. The word itself is like television. It's kind of a fusion of Greek and Latin, and it's just almost as novel. It's only coined in the 19th century. And instead, when you look at Roman writings about sex, Roman love poetry, physical evidence for it, the kind of incredible array of phalluses that are just kind of everywhere in museums of the Roman antiquities, you realize it's a really different world. And to understand it, you have to set aside everything that you think you know about how sex operates. And you have to appreciate that for the Romans, really, the binary, it's not homosexual or heterosexual. It's do you have power or do you not have power? And the person who has power in Rome is the free male citizen. And essentially, he can do anything he likes to anyone who is his subordinate. He can use them any way that he wants. So it's an incredibly brutal world. What is it that changes? What is it that persuades powerful men that they cannot just use the bodies of their inferiors as the kind of equivalent of urinals, as receptacles for their bodily fluid? And again, I think that it is the long, slow, gradual weathering process of Christianity that serves to change it, and the kind of very weird doctrines that you get, first of all, in Paul's letters. I mean, they're weird seen from the perspective of a Roman. This kind of strange melange of kind of weird Jewish doctrines that have kind of mutated into a peculiar form. And from these you get, over the course of the centuries that follow, and particularly increasing once Constantine converts to Christianity, it's like a kind of acid eating away at everything that the Romans had taken for granted about the way that sex should operate, the way that human beings should relate to each other sexually, the way that human bodies should be regarded. And we live with the consequence of that transformation to this day. And again, talked about Black Lives Matter, but the other obvious parallel would be Me Too, because the big question about Me Too that no one even really thinks to ask is, well, what's so wrong with a powerful man like Harvey Weinstein or whoever sexually abusing his inferiors? A Roman would completely have taken it for granted. And the fascinating thing about Me Too isn't that women rallied to it. It's basically that men rallied to it and accepted the justice of what was being said. Why? Such an interesting question when you come at it from the perspective of the way that the Romans understood, or at least Roman men understood how sex, what sex was about. And
to be clear, you're not suggesting that the answer is the Holy Ghost landed onto Europe and guided us into a more enlightened future. You're describing a gradual material change and intellectual change that has led to that. And your book does that very painstakingly, going through the stages as those ideas developed and their consequences. And their consequences are by no means all positive or enlightened.
So that's exactly the point. So when we say, does the coming of Christianity, is it a good or bad thing? What's the definition of good or bad? By and large, Christianity creates the standards of good and bad by which it is itself judged in Western societies. Say, people always bring up the Inquisition. What's wrong with a powerful state torturing someone innocent to death? Well, the central symbol of Christianity is an innocent man being tortured to death by the state apparatus. So in a sense, the Inquisition is being condemned for highly Christian reasons. And again, the idea that is this enlightened? So that's kind of harking back to something called the Enlightenment, which by and large people who reject Christianity or a belief in God tend to be very keen on, and imagine that it's an emancipation from Christian assumptions. And I have to say that I completely thought that myself. But when you think about what is going on in the Enlightenment, I mean, what tease out what enlightenment means. It means the bringing of people who walked in darkness into light. It means the toppling of idols. It means the banishing of superstition. And when you put it in those terms, it's not very hard to see that there's a direct line of descent there from the Protestant Reformation, which speaks completely in those terms, and of course has as its object of scorn not Christianity per se, but the Roman Church. But then you push it back further, and you think the Roman Church, is the medieval church. The missionaries that laid the foundations of that in early medieval Europe, again, they saw themselves as bringing light to the dripping, dank forests of pagan Saxony. They were chopping down the idols of the worshippers of Thor. They saw themselves as banishing superstition. And those Christian missionaries, in turn, were drawing on the much more venerable inheritance of the Hebrew prophets, who completely spoke in these terms. It's Isaiah who talks about bringing people who walk in darkness into light. It's the Hebrew prophets who talk about how the idols of Babylon or Egypt or Assyria are just stock and stone. It's the Hebrew prophets who condemn the worship of these idols as superstition. So to that extent, what we call the Enlightenment and this sense that superstition is something called superstition exists. It's bad. We have to get rid of it. We have to enlighten people. That's an inheritance of Christianity, and in turn, an inheritance of the of the Hebrew scriptures.
So going back to your own point about Black Lives Matter and Me Too, and even going back to our previous podcast, wokeness itself is a product of Christianity.
Pretty clearly. I mean, I think that's the phrase, the Great Awokening is hearkening back to the tradition of Great Awakenings that characterize Anglo-American Protestantism, that has complete, again and again, the feeling that society is steeped in sin, that there has to be repentance, and it generates a kind of great upsurge of moral fervor, a condemnation of sin and of sinners. I think that the roots of it are this is like a kind of ripple effect of earthquakes, aftershocks, spilling out and out and out and out. I think, of course, it is different because unlike the previous great manifestation of this in the 50s and 60s with the civil rights movement, which was very overtly Christian, this is not. And so I think one of the aspects of it that is, I suppose there are two aspects. One is that is a repudiation of Christianity as it's conventionally been understood. One is the idea that we are all sinners. So the idea of original sin, that's something that people in the 60s really found repulsive and turned against. The idea that kind of Western Christianity is inherited from Augustine, this idea that because Adam and Eve fell, therefore we are all saturated in the consequences of that fall, that we all have sin. But conversely, I mean, looking at it in a different way, there's something very democratic about that, actually, because if we're all sinners, then none of us can be completely virtuous. Augustine's doctrine evolved in the context of, actually, it's the very first British intellectual, a guy called Pelagius, who argued that perfection was possible for human beings, that we could become perfect. And actually, when you look at wokeness, I feel that that's quite oppressive, because it means that if you don't make yourself perfect, then you're at fault. Whereas if we are, in fact, all sinners, then in a sense, I mean, you do your best, but you're never going to become perfect. And there is a kind of strain in kind of the extreme wokeness that does imply that perfection is possible and that those who are promoting it have attained it. And I think the other thing is that the great kind of moral core of Christianity, again going right the way back to Paul, is that there is no Jew or Greek, that all are one. All are created equally. So therefore, if there's no Jew or Greek, there's no black or white. And that was the message that that Martin Luther King absolutely preached. It was a summons to white American Christians, not that they were kind of saturated in whiteness and therefore, because they were white, therefore they were inherently sinners. It was a reminder to white Americans that they, that Black Christians were their brothers and sisters. And I think that is something that has kind of slipped. I think that and the paradox is, I think, that as a result, Black Lives Matter movement has actually racialized it, the campaign, in a way that the civil rights movement didn't.
May I ask, why does it matter to recognize the Christian inheritance? What is there to be gained by recognizing this kind of origin story? And I ask that in the broad sense, but also maybe for you personally, as you look at history, what has that prism kind of meant for you as well?
Well, my book, In the Shadow of the Sword, which was about the emergence of Islam, was quite controversial because I wanted to try and understand the origins of Islam in terms that I could. I'm not a Muslim, so I don't think that God through Gabriel spoke to Muhammad. So therefore, I wanted an explanation for the emergence of Islam that would make sense to me as someone who didn't believe that, there'd been a supernatural intervention. And essentially, I kind of ended up arguing, and it's certainly not original to me. I'm drawing on much, scholars much greater scholars than me. But essentially, I ended up arguing that the stories told and believed in by Muslims about the beginnings of about the beginnings of Islam were back projections that were written centuries after the events that they described, and that the likely explanation for the emergence of Islam was rather different. I remember talking about this to an audience of Muslims, and one of them saying, I see why you've done this, but you would never do this to your beliefs, to your values. You are here as someone who doesn't believe in God. You would never question where your belief that God doesn't exist comes from. And it was the single most pointed and justified criticism that I'd had. So I became interested in a way in judging everything that I thought and took for granted, and asking, well, where does it come from? Why do I think the way that I think? And kind of a bit like following a thread through a labyrinth. That's when I began to really, really wake up to the fact that my kind of lazy assumption that there had been an enlightenment and the light switch had gone on simply couldn't be true. It was as much a myth as it was a virgin birth. The idea that it just come from nowhere.
Can you just elaborate a little bit about your assumptions about what was your cosmological view, at least when you were starting to work on Dominion?
Well, I was raised in the Church of England, but my belief in God kind of faded like a dimmer switch being lowered. Partly because I found the Greek gods much sexier and more fun and more charismatic. Partly because of dinosaurs, so kind of very Victorian crisis of faith.
Dinosaurs and Greek gods.
Yeah, in Dominion, I described as kind of. Went to Sunday school, and there was an illustrated Bible, and Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden with a brachiosaur, and I just thought, don't think that happened. well, it kind of drained my belief in the supernatural, and specifically in Christianity. But in a way, I didn't kind of. I suppose I didn't miss Christianity or any sense of religion, because I realize now that I basically had it already in the kind of core beliefs that as someone going to a university in the late 80s, growing up, then being in my 20s in London in the 90s, I was just kind of absorbing. It was kind of like like you breathe. People were breathing in radiation after Chernobyl. You don't realize you're doing it, but there it is in the air. You're just breathing it in. I was breathing in all these assumptions about liberal values, things that I didn't even have. I thought they were so kind of self-evidently right and true that I didn't even really bother to question them. And I was brought to question them ultimately. Why do I believe them? Where do my assumptions about where these things come from? Partly because of dwelling on the Romans and how different they were to us, how contrary to kind of liberal values, and also thinking about what it was about Islam that was different. And then that question that I said about where the Muslim in the audience said, well, why, you're not questioning your own beliefs in the way that you're questioning my beliefs. And I thought, that was completely right. So basically, I think that there's a kind of inherent instability within the Western form of Christianity, and perhaps especially within Protestant Christianity, that means that atheism is a kind of logical endpoint, and humanism and the atheism of the kind that's propagated by Richard Dawkins is a kind of godless Protestantism, which of course a Catholic would say is an oxymoron.
You summarize those tensions in the book as between the prerogatives of authority and the yearning for reformation, between the letter and the spirit of the law. Describe those tensions a little more.
So basically, I think everything goes back to Paul.
Everything always goes back to Paul on this podcast.
I mean, I always remember in church, whenever we had a reading from Paul, I'd switch off even more than I was already, because it just seemed just sounded gibberish. I mean, it's kind of, I had no idea what they were talking about. It just sounded really dull. And the letters are quite hard, I think, but I think they are by a kind of quantum degree the most influential texts that we have from the period of the Roman Empire. I mean, basically, they kind of underpin almost everything. And the spirit and the letter of the law, because Paul has a problem, because he thinks that the crucifixion has in some way delivered a second covenant, a second covenant between God's chosen people and God himself. But Paul is convinced that God's chosen people now includes everyone. So there is no Greek or Jew. So the distinctiveness of his Jewishness is kind of dissolved in this. But the question then becomes, well, what is this covenant? The Jews have a covenant. It's written down, got given to Moses. Where is the covenant that God has agreed with his chosen people with Christ? And Paul's answer to this is that the covenant is written on the heart. And he reaches for a phrase that he takes from the Stoics, who believed that the divine was manifest in the whole of creation, and therefore within every human being. And the Stoics called this synodesis. It's the divine spark is in the heart. So we could translate it as conscience. So Paul basically says that the law of God now is written on the heart. It's there within the conscience. So you look inside your heart and you hope that the Spirit will illumine your heart and let you know what is what is true, what the law of God is. Now, of course, that hardwires in an assumption that you, in a Christian society, you can have law that is of that the ultimate law can be written down by humans who've looked into their hearts and written it down. but it also hard bakes in the idea that over the course of time, God's Spirit will illumine people's understanding of what his purposes are more and more. So you have this idea that law can become something that's progressive. But you also have the idea that over time, that understanding can be occluded by the sinful nature of the fallen world. So you have these kind of tensions. One is that law can be progressive, that society can be progressive, that we can get closer and closer to an understanding of what God's purposes are, that the Spirit will illumine us. Against that, there's the anxiety that as you go through time, so you're going further from the kind of the founding of the church, from the time of Jesus, and sin is corrupting and tarnishing human society. So that requires a great process of self-cleansing, a process of kind of renewal of baptism and washing away of sin. And over the course of Christian history, that's repeatedly been weaponized. And it takes a particular form in the Latin half of what has been the Roman Empire. Because what happens there is that you don't have the kind of the empire, the emperor that you have in the eastern half in Constantinople. And so the people are able in the church are able essentially to kind of construct this model whereby the church itself becomes the agent for cleansing and sanctifying society, and even emperors and kings have to submit themselves to it. So in the 11th century, you have an emperor, supposedly the heir of Charlemagne and Constantine and Augustus, kneeling in the snow before the Pope, and you have the church setting itself up as something that is sovereign, something that Christians across Latin Christendom can appeal directly to the Pope and the church over the heads of earthly kings. And you have this kind of split that is really distinctive to the Latin West, rival ideas of something called the saeculum, the order. Saeculum in Latin means the span of human memory. So it becomes this idea that you have an earthly order, a secular order, and then you have an order that is distinct from that, a religio, the bond that the church is able to join humans to the timelessness of the unchanging order of the city of God. So you have this apposition between the city of man and the city of God. And this in the 11th century gets kind of enshrined at kind of level of society, the sense that there's something that will ultimately be called the secular, that there's something ultimately that will come to be called religion, beds down really strong. And this process, it's kind of a revolutionary process, which sees kings being humbled, a new model of society being imposed, warriors who are committed to this new model, taking it to the limits of the earth in the form of crusades, entire new frameworks of radical intellectuals gathering together in what come to be called universities and imposing new understandings of what society should be on people that they condemn as deplorables, as rednecks, as peasants, as people who don't understand what this new reformed society should be about. All of these make of medieval Christendom in the West, over from the 11th century onwards, Europe's first revolutionary society. And you have a prototype there for every kind of convulsion that has happened since. So the Protestant Reformation, although it reacts against the Roman Church, is nevertheless absolutely part of the same tradition. It's doing exactly the same. It's trying to overthrow what it sees as a corrupt order, to wash the stain of sin, to wash society clean of the stain of sin, to set the secular order to one side and establish what religion should clearly be. It inspires people to draw arms, to fight, to kill in aid of it. It inspires intellectuals to try and impose new order on first of all European societies, and then in due course new societies across the Atlantic. And the same thing happens in the Enlightenment, which again, expressed through first the American and then particularly the French Revolution. Again, you see kings being humbled. You see attempts to cleanse a new society. It's to wash it in blood. And I think to a lesser degree, you see it now in what we're living through at the moment. In a sense, the 60s is a kind of another process of great convulsion, a desire to cleanse, to reorder. And I think that the sense of antagonism that you have very manifestly in America at the moment, between people who see themselves as entrusted with a great moral responsibility, a charge to cleanse society, to purify it, to set it on new foundations, to wipe away old sins, and the impatience that people who by and large are better educated, who are products of universities in particular, with people who are not products of universities. Again, that's something that goes back through the centuries, right the way back to the 12th centuries. And I think that in that sense, the fascination of it is to realize that we are creatures of our historical DNA. We just cannot kind of escape it. And in a sense, the whole of Western civilization, as it's existed since the 11th century, is like San Francisco, built on the San Andreas Fault. It stands there stable for maybe, decades, centuries, and then suddenly there's a great grinding of the tectonic plates and everything comes tumbling down and it has to be rebuilt again. And then the same process happens again.
It reminds me a little bit of disruption theory in terms of innovations, where it's often it's not necessarily a better idea that gets adopted and takes off. It's like it's a more accessible, but oftentimes kind of worse idea, but somehow kind of speaks to people.
And it's the accessibility of it that's the key. To go back to what I was saying before, this is coded not in philosophy or moral commandments so much as in stories, right? Simple stories.
Which then does beg the question: then, what on earth has happened to the morality of our current times?
Well, I think that the what's radical about Christianity, and it's a kind of it's there obviously within the inheritance of the Hebrew Scriptures that Christians bundle into the Christian Bible, but is the idea that there is strength in weakness, and this is what Nietzsche picks up on Christianity. Nietzsche is, in a way, I think, penetrates to the heart of what makes Christianity strange and distinctive and influential in a way that very few Christians do, because he recognizes that at the heart of Christianity is a valorization of those who are oppressed, those who suffer, those who are slaves. And the figure of Christ on the cross and the fact that he then emerges triumphant from the dead, to ascend to heaven, and he suffered the death of a slave. This is the triumph of the slave over the master. This is the triumph of the tortured over the torturer. This is the triumph of the oppressed over the oppressor. And it's like a kind of depth charge under every structure of privilege. And it means that the privilege can become something that is problematic, mm-hmm. something that you hang as as something evil, as something that you have to be cleansed of. And it's there again and again through the whole history of Christianity, the rich trying to give up their wealth, to throw it away. In the French Revolution, to be rich, to be privileged, can lead to your death. And now, to be privileged is to be unprivileged. To have no privilege is to be a source of privilege. Intersectionality, to that degree, is just a recalibration of something that's been fundamental to the way that Christians have operated throughout Christian history.
And Nietzsche saw that as an intellectual virus.
Absolutely. Nietzsche hated it because Nietzsche, even though he was kind of short-sighted and hypochondriac and wouldn't have lasted a minute in ancient Athens or Rome, was really into the idea that that the strength was all, and that the strong, the beautiful, the brave had basically been corrupted. The blonde beast had been tamed and kind of immured in a monastery and had become a kind of a sick, miserable thing. And that this was terrible. And and that therefore we needed to basically get over this terrible slave morality that Christianity had instilled. What we know that Nietzsche didn't is that this would be taken up by the Nazis. And essentially the Nazis did indeed, they were the first regime in Western history not just to turn their back on institutional Christianity as the French revolutionaries did, or the Russian revolutionaries, but the core morals, the kind of moral heart of Christianity. And they repudiated the idea that the slave would triumph over the master. They thought the master should crush the slave, just as the Romans had done. And they also repudiated the idea that there was no Jew or Greek, because they thought that absolutely Jews and Greeks were racially distinct. And the horrors that unleashed has had such a, it's left such a mark that, in a sense, and I think that this is one of the reasons why, certainly in Europe, institutional Christianity drops off a cliff in the 60s, is this kind of dawning realization that we don't really need institutional Christianity to have those Christian values, because rather than ask what would Jesus do, we just have to ask what would Hitler not do. And basically that's the guiding principle in every Western society now, is what would Hitler not do, which is why the ultimate insult now isn't to say, Satanist or whatever. It's you're a Nazi.
It feels like we're at a moment where societally, at least the West, and maybe even the world, because the world has bought into the Christian story to a large extent, in the secularized form of human rights, and but it feels like we're at a point where even that story is cracking. And is that
absolutely?
And
absolutely.
I'm wondering, is that because more that the inherent tensions of the Christian story that constantly create, like, to be Leninist for a minute, the contradictions have been heightened, or is it because we are fracturing because the mirroring of what Hitler would not do is not strong enough to keep the story together?
I think that's part. I think Nietzsche famously says that without Christian belief, you can't really have Christian values. And I think that ideas like human rights or secularism, they don't just exist. These are essentially theological constructs. They're rooted in Christian theology and history. So if you just say, well, human rights exist, they don't. they don't exist. They have no objective existence whatsoever. So to believe in human rights is just as much a leap of faith as to believe that the Lord Jesus Christ rose on the third day and ascended into heaven. It's just that we don't think that anymore. We just, rather like, and that was a condition of Christian belief in the Middle Ages. People didn't realize that they were believing. Just like most of us, we don't believe in human rights. We just think that they exist. So that's part of it, I think, is that when people say, well, why should we let refugees in? And liberals turn around and say, well, that human rights. And people turn around and say, I don't give a stuff about human rights. What are human rights? And liberals say, well, you're a fascist then. And people say, well, I don't care. What recourse do liberals have to say, well, actually, you have to let refugees in? If you're a Christian, you can quote the Bible. You can quote, whatever, great inheritance of Christian charity. But if you don't believe, and you can do that because you believe that this is what God has told you to do, that you believe that this is what Jesus commanded. But if you don't have that, then ultimately all you can do is kind of say, well, I think that they exist, so you ought to think that they exist. And this is a problem for Western, for liberal society within the West, but I think it's also a growing problem for Western countries on the global stage, because essentially what the West did, and anti-slavery was the prototype for this. So when the British pushed for the abolition of slavery, they did so. The British government did so because they had a massive evangelical movement breathing down their neck. A kind of the first mass protests really in Western history, forcing a change in government policy. But the British government, when they went to negotiate with the Catholic powers, couldn't justify the abolition of slavery in Protestant terms. So they had to find a kind of a mutually shared language that Catholics and Protestants could share. And then when Europeans tried to persuade the Ottomans to abolish slavery, again, they couldn't talk in overtly Christian terms. So they had to try and couch their opposition to slavery in terms that could appeal to kind of the idea that there's a universal commandment here. And the Western powers, because they were hegemonic at the time, because they had all the military, cultural, economic influence, were able to do this, to pass off their very culturally contingent ideas on slavery, on human rights, on the secular, as just kind of the way things were. And in a way, the high watermark of that was the United Nations Charter. They were able to present these ideas as though they were so universal that every country in the world had to sign up to them. But what's happened recently is that as Western power retreats, so the kind of culturally contingent nature of those assumptions about human rights, about the secular and so on, have come into to retreat as well.
Separation of church and state.
Yeah, well, you see that really clearly with events this summer, both in India and in Turkey. So in India, you have Modi, the prime minister, laying this foundation stone for a great temple on the site of what many Hindus think is the birthplace of Rama, the great hero of the Ramayana. And this was a place where a mosque had stood. And lots of Hindus had come to believe that the mosque had been deliberately built on the site of Rama's birth. And so a Hindu mob tore it down in the 90s. And this was a seismic shock to secular opinion in India, which assumed that India is a secular republic, that this sort of thing couldn't happen. But essentially, the reason India is a secular republic is because the British exported the idea of the secular, and it was taken up by Indian English-speaking elites and written into the Indian constitution. But now, as the hold of those English-speaking elites recedes, so you are getting a kind of a desire on the part of many Hindus in particular to repudiate that as a kind of alien ideology. And in a sense, it is an alien ideology. It's one that would have meant nothing to anyone in India before the British went. And also, you see it in Turkey, where President Erdogan reconsecrated what had been the cathedral of Hagia Sophia, built by the Emperor Justinian, turned by Ataturk, the father of Turkish secularism in the 30s, into a museum. And then this summer got turned by Erdogan back into a mosque. I missed out that when Constantinople fell to the Turks, the cathedral got turned into a mosque. And that's what Erdogan has turned it back into. And again, that is what Erdogan is doing, is repudiating the secularism of the Turkish Republic as something alien, which again it is. It is. And you could almost see the similar tensions in Israel, because in a sense, what happened to Jews in the 19th century with the French Revolution was that previously the Jews had seen themselves as a people, as the people of Israel. And when the French Revolution said, well, as Jews, you can come out of the ghetto, you can have civic rights, you can become citizens of France. But the quid pro quo was that Jewish citizens of France had to identify themselves primarily as French and had to reconstruct what Christians had always called Judaism, but Jews hadn't. They had to see themselves as belonging to something called Judaism, which was a religion. And this concept of religion was a kind of, it's a Christian idea. So over the course of the 19th to 20th centuries, Jews in Western countries have been encouraged to see themselves as belonging to a religion called Judaism. just as since the Second World War, Muslims in the West have been encouraged to think of themselves as belonging to a religion called Islam. Right. But with the existence of Israel, there's been scope for Jews to go back to a kind of a pre-French Revolutionary understanding of their identity, and so also that was the appeal for kind of alienated, unhappy Muslims in the West. That was the appeal of the caliphate proclaimed by the Islamic State. It provided an opportunity to kind of go back to an understanding that had existed before the rise of Western hegemony in the 18th and 19th century, so I think that is where the world is heading. I think that the understanding that Western liberals have, which is rooted in kind of the inheritance of Christian theology and history, that is retreating. That the more that happens, so the more things that liberals take for granted, we will be forced to recognise that these are culturally contingent. They're bred of the history of the West.
I also like to add, as an Israeli, which my accent clearly betrays, that this tension is manifesting on at least two different levels. First, there was the rift that's growing between Israeli Jews and diaspora Jews. They're becoming increasingly incongruent in terms of what defines their identity and their shared values. Diaspora Jews follow the Protestant model, locating their Jewish identity in the personal belief and choices of the individual, and invertedly in the universality of human experience and humanity and tikkun olam and social justice, whereas Israeli Jews still see themselves or are reverting back to seeing themselves as a people, as a nation. But this battle is also happening in Israel, in the conflict between the old left that is increasingly diminishing, but still holds on to the European Christian version of separation of church and state. And on the other side, a growing voice that wants to see some version of a more theocratic, national supremacist state. Because for that side, that is what being Jewish means. And the idea of separation of church and state for them is completely foreign and antithetical, just as it is in Modi's India or Erdogan's Turkey.
And you said, when we framed that, you said church and state. And the whole point of Israel is that it's Jewish. So people will talk about, synagogue and state or mosque and state, but it never
doesn't have the same ring.
It's church and state, because that idea of the separation of the secular from the religious is bred of the history of the church in the medieval West. And I think that whether it's Jews or Muslims or Hindus, in countries that have been incredibly influenced by Western models, I'm sure it's often subliminal, a sense that way of understanding society as being divided between church and state, as being divided between secular and religion, it is not culturally neutral. It's in a way, it's kind of like a dust haze, like the English language is for studying the classical world, that it's something that you've got to get rid of to get back to something that perhaps people feel has been lost.
What you described as the process you underwent in writing this book, I think your book and some of the other works that I've been reading recently have put me through it.
I completely took for granted despite being a historian, and no, not a historian, a student of history, I always took for granted that a secular society is a requirement for a stable government and state.
It never quite
sunk in, didn't quite register that this separation, this opposition of church and state is
such a recent localized, culturalized fiction. And without that story, you have no substance to defer to in defending it.
Likewise, I mean, because when I wrote In the Shadow of the Sword, I I described that. I said, there are things called Judaism and Islam and Christianity, and they are religions. But I don't think that anymore. There's certainly something called Christianity, because that is a word that goes back to the 2nd century AD. And there are Christians who construct something called Judaism to serve as a kind of counter to Christianity. And they construct something, by the 6th century called paganism. But these are identities that get put onto Jews and onto people, who worship the gods or whatever. And I now realize that to describe, to talk about there being a religion called Judaism in the context of, say, the 5th century AD is it's not just to Christianize it. In a sense, it's to Protestantize it. And this is exactly the problem with writing about, basically pre-modern history, is that these are the these are the elephant traps that are waiting for you everywhere you go. And if you start writing about Judaism in the Middle Ages, it's kind of as anachronistic as saying that Julius Caesar conquered France. It's kind of right, but it's also not right. And that's really why I wrote Dominion, was as much for myself as for any, because I wanted to work. I wanted to kind of stress test all these words that I've been using and say, well, where did they originate from? Where do they come from? Where is it acceptable to use it? So it was, it was a kind of challenge to write a history of Christianity that doesn't use the word religion until I get to the 18th century. But I think that's right. I don't think that you should use words that carry a signification that are anachronistic when used in certain periods.
Even today, I think this is a great line to draw. Again, from my direct experience of Judaism, growing up in Jerusalem, you see something that is definitely does not answer to the definition of religion as you put it, because it is much more statist. It is inherently legalistic. It believes in enforcing certain rules and behaviors in society, and doesn't give a damn about what you believe in your heart of hearts.
Right, which is Protestant.
Exactly. And then if you travel across the ocean and you meet American Jews and you see something completely different, and their understanding of what it means to be Jew, how you celebrate it, how you express it, is contradictory. And not only contradictory, they view each side views the other as violating the heart of Judaism. And that is because the American version is, and I think a lot of the diaspora is, like you said, it's Protestantism. It's Protestantism with a Jewish face.
I think Reform Judaism is kind of very self-consciously Protestant. I mean, it's an attempt, to construct a model of something called Judaism that can kind of take its place alongside Lutheranism or whatever. And I think that essentially liberalism is again, it's atheist Protestantism, and there's a sense in which the Protestant churches in certainly in Europe, and I think in America too, apart from the Pentecostalists, are kind of in decline. But I think that's only seemingly so, because I think actually, in a way, Protestantism has dissolved itself so completely that it's now just become the air that people breathe in. It's become the waters that people swim in. Because at the essence of Protestantism is exactly this idea of enlightenment, that the Spirit illumines. You have a kind of a direct link. You have your personal beliefs, that you have your personal religio, your personal bond with God, and you know that things are right because you know that they're right ultimately. And
that progress is possible and is a good thing.
Absolutely. So those are all kind of fundamentals to it. So if you ask a liberal, well, why do you think this? The odds are they say, well, I just know it's right, and they know it's right because they're heirs to the Protestant tradition that tells you that you look into your heart to know what is right, and you feel yourself justified. And if you feel yourself justified, then you know that you're right. It's the operation of grace. So I think that liberals, and again I kind of speak for myself here, are people who feel sanctified by a kind of secular experience of grace. They feel that their hearts have been opened to the truth. But this is a theological, fantastical idea.
I mean, I'm listening to you both, and it sounds like you've kind of gone through this process of your own kind of revelation in terms of understanding the way that we think has been constructed around a Christian framework. But I kind of want to go back to my earlier question, because where does it leave us, right? Where does it, now that the haze has been somewhat lifted, and we're starting to evaluate our present with a better understanding of the past, then what? And I think, like, as an individual, it sounds like there's a sense of awakening, I suppose, just the way that you guys are talking about it. But on a societal level, where does it leave us?
I don't know. And I don't feel any great responsibility to think I do, because I've only written it because I think it's interesting. That's basically why I've done it. Is I just think it's so interesting for its own sake. It's not that I'm offering this as that it will change society or anything. Or I just think it's really, really interesting. I mean, what I suppose I would say is that I think that it kind of makes me feel that I can't really take anything for granted, I guess. I guess I'm a liberal who's lost his faith. I don't really believe it anymore. If I hold to kind of liberal principles, it's in the way that a Catholic who's lost his faith still, goes to church and does the rituals. So I'm kind of looking around for some solid foundation on which to rest my gut instincts. I think it is quite a corrosive process in that sense. Where will society go? I think that in Europe and in America, I guess there are three routes. One is that liberalism has become self-sustaining. So Nietzsche was wrong. You don't need Christianity to fuel it. It just, people will just, it's so self-evidently right that it will just propagate itself. So Christianity was like the kind of the body of the rocket that got you through the atmosphere, and now you can jettison it and float through space and time without the boosters. The other possibility is that Nietzsche was right, and that without Christian belief, Christian values will atrophy, and you will get an increasing insistence on the part of people that they don't owe anything to the weak or the poor, and that they don't, that the idea of a kind of universal humanity is junk, that, America first, or, let's pull up the drawbridge or whatever. And perhaps, looking at various Western countries, that might shade into a kind of soft form of fascism, perhaps. We've all been pretty inoculated, but fascism was very attractive to people. That's the kind of terrible truth. People like strength and power and glamour and swagger and flags and
dinosaurs.
Yeah, people like dinosaurs, exactly. And the third possibility, I suppose, is that people might think, "Wow, shit, we better cling to Christianity." Even if it's a kind of quite soft form of Christianity. So I don't know which of those will happen. But I can't really see any other. Those are the three roads that I think Western societies are likely to take. The much more interesting question is what will happen in the rest of the world, and I think there we can see that it's a process of returning to their own civilizational roots, and that's true of the Muslim world. It's true of India. It's true of China, and so that's what makes me think that perhaps the West as well will do that. That it will return to a sense of its own civilizational roots, the less global it feels that it is. Because at the moment, the West still thinks that its values are universal. It still thinks that it's the way the West sees the world is the way the world is. And I think the more that we inhabit a multipolar civilizational world where other ways of seeing what humanity are about come to have their own heft. So the more the West will come to recognize that its own values are not universal. And I think that will kind of foster a sense, well, we are what we are.
Our interconnectivity, made it, I think, to some extent, deflated the ability to believe in a common story because it's stretched it too thin. But isn't it also a challenge for societies that are trying to regress to their more internal language of thought, just because things are still the visibility of everything that happens around the world and the commentary of everything that happens around the world happens on a global scale, unless you create your own internet like Russia and China does.
I don't think that Modi particularly cares. I don't think Erdogan cares. I don't think that Xi cares. I really don't think they care what the West thinks anymore. And I don't think that they care. In India or Turkey, I don't think that the ruling parties care what the kind of secular traditional elites think. I mean, it may be that they go too far and the secular elites fight back, but doesn't seem to be happening. And in China, in China, they are, we say never again. In China, they are locking up 1 million people in concentration camps, sterilizing them, making them work as slaves. And do we care? We don't care at all. Everybody's talking about slavery, but the slavery that we're talking about is the slave, the inherited sins of our civilization. We care about ourselves. We care about our morality. We care about our souls. We care about our inheritance of sin. We don't care what the Chinese do, really. We don't care about the Uyghurs.
So universalism basically reached its peak in the 60s, 70s, and now it's just receding.
I think it had one kind of final Indian summer, as it were. Maybe not the right phrase, but in the 90s, where people really did think history had ended. And of Fukuyama and Huntington, I think Huntington has turned out to be much more of a prophet. I think he's right. I think we are moving into a world of multiple civilizations, and I think that COVID and the fragmentation that's imposed will only expedite that process.
Do you have any other hunches on where things are going? And it's not as an expert in future telling, but just this is, I think, where we're coming from.
Although of a reader of and lover perhaps of sci-fi and fantasy, there could be some hints there as well.
No, but what I will say is that one of the things that struck me when I was writing about the collapse of the Roman Empire and the coming of Islam was the way in which the collapse of Roman power was such a protracted and seismic event that it generated myths that still haunt us, of which the most potent is obviously Islam. But if you look at the opposite end of the Roman Empire in Britain, there's a very similar myth. Which is the story of Arthur. An order of people committed to defending the truth who have their kind of moment in the sun and then fade, but will come again. But those stories continued to resonate through modern fantasy and science fiction. So the coming of Islam and the collapse of Rome is there in Dune. The collapse of the Roman Empire and the establishment of kingdoms on the ruins is there in Lord of the Rings. So both science fiction and the collapse of the Roman Empire is there in Asimov's Foundation. So all these foundational texts of science fiction and fantasy are kind of drawing on this seismic event that happened centuries and centuries and centuries ago. And I think that the collapse, if it's indeed the collapse, let's say the retreat of Western power will have a similarly seismic impact. I think it will. The very process of the retreat of Western power will, in a way, ironically embed it, because it will generate myths and tropes and ways of seeing the world that will endure for God knows how long. And the fact that the West basically has invented the internet and control, it has Hollywood, it has its TV, its entertainment is still as influential as it is, means that they will continue, the soft power will continue to endure, even if the hard power perhaps isn't what it was.
So last question, and that's the theme of I think of that motivated us to create the blog. I think it's the sense of a loss of shared meaning or even a personal direction, this kind of floating in empty space feeling that I think a lot of us are having right now. How do you start to fill up that void?
I personally found the process of studying all these Christian texts over the course of 2,000 years, I found it actually a very moving and humbling experience, because I realized that so much that I dismissed as kind of retrograde superstition actually was the expression of people who were wrestling with issues that I also wrestle with, because in a way they were creating the cultural context in which I exist. So the effect of that lingers with me as something perhaps more than just food for historical study, because I think that in a way, although I don't believe in a supernatural dimension, I think that if I'm going to try and believe in a supernatural dimension, I have to believe in the cultural tradition of the supernatural that I've been raised in and that I am heir to. So to that extent, I'm experimenting with trying to see the world through non-modern eyes. Not arriving at a point of kind of coherent belief in a given framework of the supernatural, but kind of experimenting and thinking, well, what would it be like to see the world through the eyes of a Protestant divine in the 17th century, or a mystic in the 14th century, or a monk in the 5th century, and just to imagine, well, what if it were real? And I find the experience of doing that actually incredibly powerful and humbling, because it makes me appreciate that in a way my lack of belief is just a belief as well, and perhaps not as interesting a belief. I mean, I actually really think that. I really think that my lack of belief is incredibly dull. I think atheism is really dull compared to belief in a world where there are angels and angels with trumpets. And it's so much more fun.
Tom Holland, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much. Really appreciated it.
I'm really sorry I've got to rush off to supper, but thank you much for having me. Lovely to talk to you. And
thank you for tolerating my fanboy. I even realized that in my excitement, I referred to Richard Dawkins as Charles Dawkins, obviously thinking about Darwin, because obviously they are the same.
He'd be thrilled by that. That's a kind of James Joyce crossover. He'd really love that.
It was thrilling to talk to you, but I got to mention that I had the honor in the past 5 years to produce a variety of interviews with a variety of individuals, presidential candidates included, and none have left me so discombobulated in excitement as interviewing you.
Well, I'm very honored and I'm thrilled to hear that, and really touched. Thanks so much. You've made my weekend.
Thank you, Tom.
Lovely to talk to you both.
You can follow Tom on Twitter at Holland_Tom, and you should definitely buy his books. Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. You can find us on uncertain.substack.com. Please like, share, subscribe. We have have great guests coming up talking about the end of the world and politics. So until then, stay sane.